You have directly observed microfossils in Murchison, Orgeal, Polonnaruwa, Rainbow, and Tagish Lake.
Oh, many more than that.
Many more than that?
Oh my God, yes, many, many more than that.
Get out of here.
Hello. Today I'd like to highlight an exchange I had with astrobiologist Dr. Graham Lau on the topic of panspermia and the evidence for microfossils that we've collected over the past half century. And for the purposes of this discussion, we'll be focusing on the work of Professor Richard Hoover, who was NASA's lead astrobiologist at the Marshall Space Flight Center, as well as Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, who is one of the pioneers of the panspermia hypothesis. Dr. Lau is a research investigator with the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science, the Director of Communications and Marketing for Blue Marble Space, the Director for Logistics for the University Rover Challenge, the Research Community Coordinator for the Life Detection Forum, an affiliate member of the Network for Life Detection, which is a NASA astrobiology program, as well as the host of the show Ask an Astrobiologist, which is also sponsored by NASA. So you'd think with those credentials, this individual would be curious, to say the least, as it relates to any evidence purporting to show microfossils, extraterrestrial microfossils to be more specific. And given that we live in the world of social media, I thought it might be nice to reach out and see what he had to say concerning the work of Professor Hoover and Professor Wickramasinghe. So my tweet to him was, why haven't scientists accepted Professor Richard Hoover's discovery of microfossils in meteorites? Dr. Lau responds, I actually haven't heard of that claim, but science isn't about just accepting or denying an argument. Any interpretation should be subjected to rigorous review. You're absolutely right, Dr. Lau. Rigorous review is necessary for such a claim. My question is, are you suggesting that it hasn't been? If you haven't heard of the claim, then what makes you think it hasn't been subjected to rigorous review? Dr. Lau continues, in the case of purported microfossils in meteorites, such as with the famous ALH 84001, often many researchers will explore whether such features are truly of biological origin through a variety of tests. For instance, just having a shape or form that seems similar to cells, a morphological feature, wouldn't be enough to state that something is of biological origin in many cases. Now, for those of you who don't know what he's talking about, he's referencing a famous meteorite called the Allen Hills meteorite, which was discovered in the 80s and made headline news later on in the 90s when President Bill Clinton had a press conference on the White House lawn concerning a particular observation or discovery within the meteorite that seemed to indicate that there were microfossils, little tiny critters, bacteria perhaps, that were once alive, that had been fossilized within the rock itself. So this caused a lot of controversy because the NASA team that discovered it published their research seeming to suggest that, hey, what we're looking at here is fossilized microbes. And there have been other studies since then which have suggested, no, it's not really microbes. So this, for the past 30 years has caused a lot of debate. But I'm not talking about the Allen Hills meteorite. I'm talking about the work of Professor Hoover and his discovery of other microfossils within different meteorites. So I followed up with him and I said, well, we've already got the evidence for microscopic extraterrestrial life. I meant to write fossils. The question is, why don't astrobiologists know this? I've got the receipts, but otherwise look up Hoover and Wickramasinghe in your research paper archives. It's my belief that most astrobiologists are simply unaware of Professor Richard Hoover and Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, who have arguably done more in the past half century to further the investigation of microfossils and meteorites than anybody else. So until we can actually talk specifically here about these other two individuals and not the NASA team that discovered this other meteorite that I'm not referencing, we can't really have an effective dialogue. Dr. Lau continues and he says, well, we certainly already have many claims of discoveries of alien life, but none of them have yet held up to scrutiny nor any scientific rigor in their analysis. As I mentioned previously with regard to claims about finding microfossils in meteorites, there hasn't yet been any work that shows beyond a doubt that such materials are indeed biological in origin. Well, Dr. Lau, as you just indicated, you never heard about these claims about Professor Hoover and Professor Wickramasinghe, so what makes you so sure that their work is incredible? You know, it doesn't seem like you're talking specifically about their research, and I question whether or not you've even read their research. If this is the first time you're hearing about it, then surely you would just want to take a look at their published research instead of just taking my word for it. But regardless, I asked Professor Hoover how it's possible to identify biological structure in a meteorite, and here's what he had to say.
How do you tell the difference between the two? It's just through training?
The difference between...
Something that's biological and something that isn't, but looks similar.
Well, if you're dealing with microfossils, again, you look at the elemental composition. But, again, you can't always tell. That's why it's not a good idea to make your decisions based on structures that can be made both by non-biological and by biological mechanisms. And in point of fact, I've been cautious about that from the very beginning that I started doing this work. I only pay attention to forms that are clearly recognizable as biological, even though in some occasions I can say this has all of the characteristics of a biological entity, but I have never seen anything like this before. Because we don't, there are many people in the world that have never seen an animal called an okapi. But if they went to the Antwerp Zoo and they saw the okapi, which looks like it's got a zebra brown and white coloration of the neck, looks almost like a giraffe neck, but it's on another body, they would say, I've never seen anything that crazy looking before, but they would say, yeah, that's an animal. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. I go on the internet, I find some guy, I'm looking to pick a fight. I'm like, yes, in fact, there are microfossils in meteorites. I got a guy here in Alabama who's studied them his entire career. He knows everything about them. He knows a whole lot more about them than most other people. And here's what they'll respond with. It's just contaminated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, something you said there was wrong. I don't know everything about them. I wish the heck I did. There are a bunch of things that we've found that I haven't a clue what I'm looking at and that are totally bizarre. But the point is, I have literally, since 1996, now what is that? 2006, 2016.
28 years ago?
28 years. For 28 years, I have devoted an enormous amount of time and research to these meteorites, and specifically to the microbiology of the meteorites. So when someone says, well, I don't believe it, well, that's fine. Do you believe the Earth is round?
They'll say it's contaminated.
Oh, well, okay.
Meaning an Earth creature
crawled in
as soon as you put it under the microscope.
Yeah. Well,
and your response is?
The response is, I can prove they're not contamination because of several things. These meteorites...
Now, first of all, before you continue, you said prove.
Prove.
This means something.
This means something.
This is
I can prove.
To prove something means you have more than just evidence.
You have solid evidence. You have solid evidence from more than one experiment.
So I'm going to write prove in all capital letters with an underline underneath.
With an underline.
Okay, you can prove what?
When I look at the fossils in these meteorites, on a very few occasions I can detect up to a couple of percent, in one case 3% nitrogen, but almost always you can't see nitrogen at all.
If it has no nitrogen,
then that means it is ancient.
So Dr. Lau continues. He says, there's even a good deal of recent research that has made us question some older established claims of microfossils from Earth based on morphology alone. We've found that there are non-biological processes that can create features that look exactly like many morphologies that have been called microfossils. I quite enjoy entertaining the possibilities, but just because something is possible doesn't make it probable. When it comes to potential detections of alien life, the proposed evidence has to stand up to thorough review by others than just those making the claims. Yes, of course. So if this research is new to you, then surely you might want to dig into it. But at the very least, just look at these images. Is it your position that these structures, so obvious I don't really even need to highlight where they are the result of some chemical or geological process? I mean, do you honestly not think that these things look somewhat, at least, biological in origin? So what you're looking at here are diatom microfossils that were found embedded within the Orgueil meteorite that fell to France in 1864. And when you compare these images to the images that Professor Hoover took of the interior of the Polonnaruwa meteorite, he found these same little critters in a completely different meteorite. Now, just to clarify, these things are not living, they are fossilized, so they didn't just jump in as soon as the rock landed down on Earth. But here we have two completely different meteorites. One fell in France in the 19th century, and one fell in Sri Lanka in the 21st century. And they have these very similar microfossils embedded within them. Surely that's enough to warrant a closer look, one would think. But if we dig into the Polonnaruwa meteorite a little bit more, Professor Wickramasinghe did find diatoms that look different than this one elsewhere in the meteorite, and he also discovered something else known as an acritarch, and more specifically a hystricosphere. And here's a clip of Chandra discussing that discovery.
What is more important even than the diatoms is a structure that was discovered both in Cardiff and in the US by Mr. Hoover of something called an acritarch, which is an extinct microorganism, extinct on the Earth for something like 3 billion years or so, and you got that inside the Polonnaruwa meteorite. So it's a bizarre situation where you're making the assertion that this cannot be this is an Earth rock, and you have stuff in it that cannot be anywhere near the Earth's surface at the present time. Maybe they are deeply buried or something, but the acritarchs have been out of the Earth's environment for something like 3.5 billion years. So that's another aspect that is really very interesting in this whole story. But the general position is that the stronger that the evidence becomes for extraterrestrial life and for panspermia, the stronger is the resistance, both institutional and societal. I think people are not used to the idea of admitting that we are not supreme, life on Earth is not supreme, and life on Earth is not essentially unique in the universe. So this is an obstacle that is largely a cultural obstacle, but one that is continually facing us at every turn. There's no question that culture plays a very, very important part in controlling the general public's attitudes and views on life in the universe.
So going even further, I was delighted to hear about some additional published research from my friend and colleague George Howard, who informed me about this discovery of microbes on the exterior of the International Space Station. So for a handful of years, the astronauts actually went out and took samples. They swabbed the exterior of the International Space Station, the outside window of the International Space Station, and they found microbes year after year. And the question is, where did they come from? So I asked George Howard about this, and here's what he had to say.
On your website, you've got a blog post titled Microbes entombed in cosmic dust collected from outside surface of space station window. I'm going to quote, "If you can ask people if they believe that microbial life forms are raining more or less constantly into the atmosphere from beyond, you will no doubt get blank stares from 100%. It is more widely believed that people's bodies are probed in their bedrooms by extraterrestrials than little ETs by the trillions might waft through your open window."
Yeah, I still believe that. It's amazing that people will believe that aliens will, and hell, maybe they do, crawl in your window and probe your anus, right? But you say that microbial life is out there and floating in ambient space, entombed in cosmic dust, and people just never heard such a crazy thing. You know, no, that's space. You'd have to be in a flying saucer to live.
Yeah.
You know, that there's not another level there, that there's just aliens.
Right.
But how could there possibly be diatoms and plankton floating around in space? Because space is a vacuum and everything dies if it's in space.
See, I've found the same thing. I'll talk to people in the UFO circles.
Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, we're now having that conversation as a culture about flying saucers for real.
Yeah.
And what the government may or may not know. You know, it's like that scene from Independence Day where the president's like, "Oh no, Roswell is just a bunch of malarkey," or whatever he said. And then the guy in the background, he's like, "Actually, sir, that's not entirely accurate." You know, like that's a little too true to life for me. So now I'm like, okay, wow, there must be something going on here. But anyway, I'll talk to these folks in the UFO community and I'll bring up this concept of life on Mars and they think, no, that's a bunch of BS. And it's like, okay, you're going to believe the flying saucer over microbes on a planet right next door.
Right.
Okay, it's just surprising. That's so surprising.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here is that up there in the International Space Station, we've got astronauts from both the United States and Russia, and from time to time, they'll go out onto the outside surface of their windows, and I like how you phrased it here. They'll do a swab of the biological scum that is accumulated on the outside of their windows. So, to tell me about their research into doing this.
Well, this is the damnedest thing I've ever encountered in all of my studies. The most frustrating one. I was waiting to pick my son up in elementary school car line one day. Saw a flash across that said, "Plankton found on space station." And immediately I said, "Hell yes, Chandra's been vindicated, man. Sweet, they found, that's right, plankton on the space station." Let me read a little bit of this. It says, TASS reported a press release from the Russian Space Agency that made reference that they'd found plankton and diatomaceous materials and viral materials and bacteria on the space station, which just seems absolutely incredible. But I was like, okay, but it's off to the races. We're there now. And I mean, nothing. Went crickets. You got just the clickbait things. Then space.com comes out and calls bullshit. And then they, blah, 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 and the Russians won't answer back. And maybe it was just some random press release. Crickets. And then I had missed it for a long time. It turned out that was about 2015. And what they had done, subsequently found out because not a lot of information at first. I found out they had actually published a paper 3 or 4 years later, and I had missed it. And it was in 2018, and they published a paper that gave us the details. And what they had done on 10 different occasions in spacewalks, swiped the outside of the space station at various locations, particularly the big window, like the tourist window that they hang out and look at the Earth through, right? Just swipe the outside. And it was over 5 years, 10 different times, 10 out of 10. Every one of them found scum. Bacteria, plankton, E. coli, blah, 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 blah. And that's a hell of a paper. It got no press. I had missed it. And what it did is it gave on the one hand on the other, said either it came from above or it came from below and came from Earth. Both of which are absolutely astounding discoveries. There's no other way to do it. They ruled out, these are their own scientists, but they ruled out contamination. I haven't heard anybody say it was contaminated, right? And they used procedures that would suggest that, you're not going to get contaminated 10 out of 10 when you're testing that stuff. Okay, so then you're left with it came from above or below. And they kind of punted and said there must be a yet to be explained electrical phenomena that captures bacteria in Madagascar soils and diatoms in the Barents Sea, because both of these forms of life were able to be placed, in their species where they would be on Earth, that lofts them up 400 kilometers to orbit in the space station. So that's what they landed on that paper. And they kind of gave it an either or, and we lean on this. But what the hell does that tell us? That tells us that life is just spewing out of the Earth all the time. That's cool. That proves panspermia, right? And the other alternative, the one they shied away from, was that it's incoming and that ambient space is filled with life. Now, here's an important point, because people will rightly say, well, how does a bacterium, survive in the harsh conditions of space and whatnot? It's a good question. But it isn't those little bits on their own. They're entombed in cosmic dust, right? And I think it's 100 tons a day of cosmic dust, which is really comet dust. It's disintegrating comets. And you have a zodiacal cloud out in the solar system. There's a tremendous amount of dust out there, and we're sweeping through it all the time. And these are little bits. Now, some of them are pretty big, even be visible, right? So if you take a bacterium or small, diatom or whatnot, and stick it inside one of these pieces of cosmic dust, it's orders of magnitude larger. Right? It makes a great little spaceship. And the stuff is desiccated, hibernated, and in switch off mode. It's in just add water and heat, and it'll come back.
Like sea monkeys.
And we've proved that. yeah, like sea monkeys. Exactly. And we proved that because we've taken every form of little life in space, painted it on panels, exposed it to space, and most of it survives just fine, which would suggest why would evolution endow these little creatures with the ability to withstand space unless they were made or evolved in a fashion that could inhabit space. Okay, so they got the either or paper. And then to make it even better, I was like, oh yeah, because I didn't discover either of these, and I had missed this. Then a couple of years later, or I don't know how long it was, Chandra had done another paper with the lead author of the Russian paper. And you got to take these people seriously. It's fun. Sometimes, you'll see a bunch of names on a scientific paper in some institutions, and then you'll say, well, I don't really know how serious to take these people, but you got to take these Russians serious because you know that they had their hands on materials from the space station. You got to be a pretty good scientist. You got to be up there in the ranks to even touch such things, and they had access to them, so they're serious. Well, the lead author of it, Dr. T.V. Grabenikova, a woman, is the woman that found life in space. And one of my goals is to have her get adequate credit for it. You could say Chandra and Fred found it by, finding the spectra of the clouds out there. But I don't know, really having our hands on it, came out, had it in a lab, came from space, it's life. That's Miss T.V. Grabenikova. So you had the equivocal paper. She then joined Chandra in another collection of panspermists, I think one other Russian from the first paper, and wrote another paper and said, bullshit, it came from above. And she was the lead author of the first one that equivocated. How cool is that? That she had the courage to...
She went one step further.
To go and join the radical panspermists.
Yeah.
And say this came from above. So I think Grabenikova discovered life on space, and I hope we can It's gone kind of dark according to Chandra now since the Ukraine war. It's very unfortunate. It just shows how things can get shut down that have nothing to do with. And I'd love for her to be interviewed by you. I'd love her to come to the Cosmic Summit.
That'd be great.
And I think the Russians should get credit for discovering life in space. And what a wonderful thing to have a female scientist in Russia to make that discovery. And they should take some ownership of it. And I don't know what kind of political dynamics make people like that stay quiet, but if there's any way to broach that, we'd love to fly her to Greensboro next year and have her tell her story, because she found life in space.
So as an astrobiologist, Dr. Lau, why does it seem that you're not interested in these pieces of evidence relating to your field of study? I mean, this seems to be the very thing that your entire community purports to be interested in. So, you know, I recognize that you don't know me, you maybe have never heard of these other folks, but these guys aren't fringe scientists. They worked for NASA and universities. So I question why you wouldn't be curious to look into this a little bit more deeply. And if the question is, but if the issue is that this isn't your specific field of interest, like maybe you're not a Panspermia guy, like you don't know about microfossils, well, that's fine. You know, surely you must know somebody within your community that you can refer me to who might be willing to engage in a discussion. It just strikes me as quite odd that the majority of the astrobiology community wants to ignore this evidence for extraterrestrial microfossils. But for more with Professor Hoover, Professor Wickramasinghe, and George Howard, please see my videos on YouTube. I have quite extensive coverage and conversation with these fine gentlemen, and I also feature more of them in my documentary Blue Planet Red. Thank you very much for your time.